Ndị be anyị kenene m unu. A sị n'ụbọchị nke taa dịrị n'Igbo na mma. Anyị sịkwa ka nke echikwado ya zelu dịka o si dị. Ya bụ Eastern News 24 ka anyị si na-ewetara unu ya bụ nnukwu ozi dị oke mkpa gbasịta maka ya bụ ife na-ada na-akpọtụ obodo anyị nọ n'ime ya, and gbasịta maka nnwere onwe ndị Igbo na-azọ. Dịka ị na-anya ife a bụ nwanne anyị nwaanyị Obi Ezekwesili. O nwere ife o were ịgwa ndị Igbo n'ibe akwụkwọ. Mma achọ ka Igbo ma na-ege ntị kunu gee ya bụ ife a gbasịta maka ya bụ constitution nke a na-ekwu okwu gbasịta maka ya. Anyị sị mba na anyị ga-etinyere unu kunu n'ife nwanne anyị nwaanyị bụ Ezekwesili kwuru n'iru akwụkwọ, ya bụ Obi Ezekwesili kwuru n'iru akwụkwọ gbasịta maka ya bụ ife. Mma like ka anyị ga-esi ya ka anyị tinyekwa alụ n'ụdị nke anyị ife anyị chere gbasịta maka ya bụ ife kwugasị dị iche maka ogasị ebe ọrụtagasị aka. Alright, over to you.
In the studio by the former presidential candidate and former Minister of Education, Dr. Obi Ezekwesili, who's also a former Minister of Solid Minerals, former Vice President of the World Bank, co-founder of Transparency International, and co-founder of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. She's currently the CEO of Human Capital Africa, which works in the education sector across Africa, and is the founder of the School of Politics, Policy and Governance here in Abuja. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles.
And you are often referred to as one of the driving forces behind some of Nigeria's most progressive reforms that challenged corruption, extremism, and things like gender-based violence. What does the issue of restructuring and the drive for a fresh, more representative constitution fit into what you consider to be the pecking order of priorities in Nigeria?
I actually think that within the context of the performance of our country, especially the inability of our leadership to harness and to mobilize the group resources that we have in different dimensions toward consistent top performance. The matter of fundamentally conversing on how we would agree our shared values, our national vision, our agreed common identity in a society that is as multi-plural as ours now gets to the top of the agenda. And the simple way of saying it is that the structure that Nigeria has had has contributed enormously. The evidence is, of course, there to the low productivity of a country that could be, even if you used the least possible comparator country, that would be, say, Indonesia, which, ticks the boxes in similar ways: historical, political, military adventurism, historical, colonized also, and then multi-ethnic, multi-religious. I mean, really oil, the effect of oil and natural resources. So if you looked at all of that and you said, let's just use data. I normally, crack up when I say to people that in God I trust, but every other person must bring data. And so if you use data to sort of say, how do we compare, you would find such wide gap. They have a population of about 257 million. We have a population of a little over 200 million. They are now at income per capita of almost $6,000, some 5,000 plus. We are at, we go yo-yo, but within a very low bottom of anything between $2,300 when we are fairly okay to current numbers of about $1,600. So when you look at that, and then you look at the extent, the gamut of possibilities that we have, then there are questions to be asked. And those questions are important questions that point you in the direction of the kind of structure of governance that this country has been, run on.
Yeah, let's zero in on that, because the question must then be, how might a new constitution restructure this country and shape its future for the better? How would it cater to this country's basic and fundamental needs?
Because the Constitution is the organic, the organic documentation of the practice of governance by any state, as in a country, and it encapsulates the rights of citizens and the extent and definition of sovereignty, and then the principles that shape and direct the way that governance happens. They fundamentally lay the groundwork for everything that is signaled to society. So the signaling to the citizens, the signaling to business, the signaling to the state itself, as far as the remit of what it can do and cannot do, how it can do it and not do it. The whole constitutional conversation in the case of Nigeria will take you immediately to the practice of its political system. And so that practice of political system, we have seen that to be one of the toughest barriers that we have had. And so when we chose at independence that we will be a federal system of government, a constitution that brought us into independence. And that federal structure basically thought of what it would take to optimize the prospects and possibilities and minimize the challenges of bringing disparate people with very different and diverse ethos and values and opportunities and strengths and weaknesses. It thought of that, which is what you find in multiple societies. So that's why you would look at in an Australia or in New Zealand or in Canada, and you find them constantly, even in Brazil, sort of trying to figure out how to bring all of these parts together into coherence. Yeah. So it's not just unity for the sake of unity. It is that there has to be a rallying vision, while at the same time giving people sufficient leeway and room to be as progressive, as competitive, as innovative as they can. So we haven't practiced that. We have, what happened was that in the season, I was born in 1963, but I get to hear the older ones sort of talk about regionalism and the practice of it and what it achieved in our country, and the data actually is there. Now, it is the fact that the military adventurism knocked that off. And when it knocked that off, the political class of our country suddenly realized that, wait a minute, maybe that's not a bad idea actually, because if anyone manages to fight his way to the center, then he becomes the omnipresent, and he takes all of the power, and he aggregates the power, accumulates it, deposits it in himself. And so this political level of selfishness then came in the way of the constitutional changes that are necessary to get us back to that place that was the original intention.
Right.
So what then has happened is that we have structures that are totally alienated from that which it should be connected to. So we say, oh, we have local governments. Well, we have local governments that are very centralized in their mindset. Oh, we have state governments. We have state governments that just simply look at Abuja as a place they come to collect rent for and then only do expenditure.
So they exist in theory, those institutions, but they're not being practicing what they ought to be. And the point you were making is that there needs to be some sort of corporate vision that unites all the people in that vision, and you see that that constitution as having the possibility of doing that. But what do you say to those who insist, particularly in the North, that given all their current afflictions, that a new constitution is as unpalatable as it could possibly be, and even dangerous in terms of it being a distraction, and that the document is not the problem, but those operating it are? And you just gave the example. You talked about local government. I mean, it exists in the document, but in practice, there's hardly any local government that actually exercises powers in Nigeria.
So, by the time we next saw a constitution following the period of the Civil War, the military adventurism leading to the Civil War, and then the end of the Civil War and military rule. 1979 Constitution, right, was a military version of what we should be guided by as a people. And that Constitution gives way ultimately to the 1999 Constitution, another military constitution. And so
there was the 89 Constitution, but it didn't actually take effect.
The 99 Constitution is the central thing now. Now, when you think in terms of the constitutionalism and the constitutional process, there is so much attention that is given to the substance, that is what you say about it contains, because it's the document that contains these rules and practices. But even much more attention is given to process. The legitimacy of the state is often dependent on the process that emerges, the strictures and the structures and the processes and the procedures of the state. When we look at the constitutional processes, you would find that there's an alienation of the larger bulk of the Nigerian people for whom the Constitution should be the practice of life as citizens.
But is it going to make any difference if you change the current one? I mean, a lot of people will still remain, alienated from it, given the fact that there's poverty, crushing poverty, there's illiteracy. I think you're missing and those are elements that would bring them closer to the concept of the Constitution.
But you're missing a step there. So why is it that those who argue on the necessity for this country to have a conversation that is people-centered and which then leads to agreements on what really are shared values? People who are arguing for that are people who are sensibly looking at what has happened to our society. One critical factor that enables development is what we call social capital, social cohesion. We lack it. It's depleted. You can't do much in rallying your people toward development without that. Another thing that's important is your shared values. People constantly say, because they have heard people say it, so they say it's institutions that matter, not the human beings. Oh, that's a very sound word.
Yeah, but the institutions are made up of
conflate. Okay, so we do know that the simple definition of institution is the way people do their things. Have we agreed how we do our things in Nigeria in ways that really bind us to certain sets of shared values that if anyone negated it, it wouldn't matter who they are. And then the matter of, hey, we've got different definitions. I am a woman, Christian, Igbo, just name all kinds of other affinities that I have. Yet, I am Nigerian. So being able to come to the place where a set of things enable us define that common identity. Now, you know what all of that is? That's part of the process, because the process of constitution making is to enable the citizen look at the document and see themselves in it, and that sense of ownership of how the state operates and how the people relate and interact and how the institutions and the systems work. That ownership is the most significant thing that begins to move people from country to nation. Now, nation formations are very important ingredients that succeed in determining the level of aspiration that the people have. Today's Nigeria, what would you say is our aspiration? If you asked a Nigerian and you said to them, why does Nigeria exist? Do you think we have had that conversation? We haven't. So what has happened is that even the constitutional process has always been the pastime of the, in quote, the political elite of our society. So you've got a very insignificant percentage of Nigerians who have their Rolodex of names, and those names can come together at any point in time and be chosen as the wise and often wise men, who then decide what should be in the Constitution. When you have that, especially in a world that is increasingly showing clearly that it belongs to the young. When you look at the mean age of the continent today, it's about 18.2 years. So when you have that, and yet you're holding them down to systems and contexts that are not reflecting the very important and significant issues that they want to be able to solve. So, for example, two critical things that Nigerians, the dominant young people in Nigeria, would want to see Nigeria be about is a productive country and a competitive country. When they look at themselves and they look at their colleagues in the rest of the world, they see themselves as capable of doing that. But there are barriers holding them back. And if you follow the process of Einstein would say, famous quote is, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would use if I had an hour, I would use 55 minutes asking the right questions. If I could just ask the right questions, 5 minutes is enough for me to have the answer.
Well, let me try and ask you a right question in these circumstances. You make a very powerful argument there, but your former boss, President Obasanjo, has been quoted as saying that the core problem facing Nigeria is not necessarily the constitution, but the crux of the challenges lies in the attitude and character of those who operate the constitution. What do you say to that?
The operative word being necessarily. That's important, right? So basically, when you use the word necessarily, it therefore means that you have not dismissed the argument for a constitution.
Yeah, but the second sentence, he makes it ineluctably clear that the crux of the challenges lies in the attitude and character of those who operate the constitution.
I totally agree with him that, the character of leadership is really at the heart of a lot of our political failures, but it is not enough. It is a necessary factor, very important factor, but the truth is, if you have hurdles that stand in the way of how you have divided responsibilities and duties, how you have expressed the necessity for accountability, what you have expressed as the social contract between the state and the people, what institutions operate and how they operate, so that you have upgraded and updated the effectiveness as well as the efficiency of the operation of your system through your constitution. Then even if we got the most credible of people into this Nigeria, they will come up against those barriers that are standing in the way of optimization of productivity and competitiveness of our society.
Well,
without productivity, competitiveness of Nigeria, what would happen is that people would hear that we have an income per capita of 2,000 and it will go over their heads as to what that means in terms of the viability and long-term sustainability of a country that adds 3% of population growth while growing at less than 4%.
Well, let's go from the broad and general to the particular. You made a submission, I believe it was in 2021, to the National Assembly committee that was reviewing the 1999 Constitution. What were the specifics of that submission?
Well, ours was a very simple one. We said to the then National Assembly that, there's really no need, based on what we have seen so far, there is no need to continue to tinker on the margins of this Constitution. It is fatally flawed in some of the provisions where there's a lopsidedness of centralization. The centralized approach to solving problems that can be solved at decentralized and disaggregated basis is a nightmare for performance. It is a nightmare for optimization in the use of scarce resources. So we said, stop tinkering on the margin. You can do something different to move the society toward this kind of a national conversation backed by law that then leads toward a set of issues that we are solving for, because your constitution has to be solving for something. And in that process, what you should do is a single issue amendment. Do a single issue amendment of the Constitution to allow for the process that leads to a constitutional making approach that is representative of the various layers and levels of the issues and the factors that are creating the biggest bottleneck to Nigeria's greatness. Now, if we want to be a really great country, we have to envision how to be that. The Constitution that comes out of that process would be a Constitution that amalgamates the ways that is possible. And that comes from a very thorough process and rigorous process of conversations on how countries have solved certain problems that were still stuck at the bottom trying to solve. So we said, do a single issue amendment and then allow for a referendum as part of that single issue amendment that opens up the space for a different approach than what they are doing. What they say, we're hamstrung, yes, in terms of the provision on how the Constitution can be amended. But then the evidence that we see, whether it's in terms of the political dysfunction of Nigeria as we see it today, or the social collapse of cohesion and capital, or it is in terms of economic paralysis that is not leading to the kind of structural change that can transform and make this society a society that enables those with the possibilities to be great,
Right.
to become great. Now, if you looked at all of that and all of those hurdles, what you then do is to make sure that you're not pretending that by moving some clauses in the Constitution, as is today, fatally flawed, that you can achieve that. It's the extent of your aspiration that determines whether you really want to say, let's keep, using tickets to move.
So let me just come in there, because, I mean, if they said to you, not necessarily in 2021, but today, sort of like what the president said, when the Patriots went to meet him. I mean, he made it clear that, this may well be a great idea, but that's further down the road. Let's focus on trying to deal with the immediate economic problems. If they said that to you, that people need to have cheaper food on their tables as a matter of priority, and that involves considerable intellectual and material energies going into that in order to make that happen. I'll give you an example. Today, for instance, Nigeria's headline inflation rate, the figures came out today showing that it's fallen by 80 basis points from 34.19% in June to 33.4% in July. The food inflation rate also fell from 40% in June to 39.53% in July. I mean, you may say that those are negligible sort of drops, but some say that that is the priority, easing the burden on the average consumer, which will eventually stabilize the economy. And that is happening without restructuring. What would you say?
No. So back again to the extent of your aspiration. I find it very painful that the elite of our society frankly don't understand what's going on out there. We better be awakened to the fact that the people we are leaving behind, it's such a huge number. We have poverty, biting poverty for over 100 million of our citizens. They cannot wait ad infinitum. So when you think of economic reforms as something that when you're doing it, you then don't consider the medium, longer term structural issues that are making some of your reforms almost impossible to achieve the right results, then you are missing something critical.
But why aren't the advocates of this constitutional change also focusing on the mindset and the conduct of people who will implement this document that you're
talking about? But there is a focus on it. When you do constitutional process, one of the things that would happen is that people actually define the leadership recruitment criteria for their countries. Right. They have so many things. Look, one key issue in our society today is a complete confusion of incentives and sanction. Good behavior is sanctioned, punished, and almost hated, and bad behavior is highly rewarded. So there's a perversion that has happened. Those are the values issues that get discussed, and the kind of institutional mechanisms as well as the values orientation that would change that become part of the process of your conversation. I think that sometimes when people think of this matter of constitutional change, they are thinking of it as just sit down and change the process is at the center of it. And again, back to this matter of thinking that, we're doing economic reforms, therefore any other thing is a distraction. My goodness, the capacity to actually do multiple things is assumed in governance. There is absolutely no reason why it should be a zero-sum game. There is no reason why it should be a trade-off of what would ensure the viability, the long-term sustainability of this country. Listen to me, Charles, and I hope that those who are running affairs of the state today are listening. You don't have much time You see what the citizens were saying to the political class of this country in all of the protests that sparked in this country. They actually are saying, we're impatient now. We're impatient now. If you want to achieve marginal results, stay with the structures as they are. If you want to transform in the way that the citizens have a stake and understand what their own role and duties and responsibilities are in building a Nigeria that transits from country to nation, then be bold enough to aspire for more.
Okay, and on that sobering note, I want to thank you very much indeed. It's been absolutely brilliant talking with you. Dr. Obi Ezekwesili was a former presidential candidate, former Minister of Education, former Minister of Solid Minerals, former Vice President of the World Bank, co-founder of Transparency International, co-founder of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, and currently CEO of Human Capital Africa, and also founder of the School of Politics.
Dịka si ga ya bụ ife nwanne anyị nwaanyị kwuru n'iru akwụkwọ ka ife were ikwu n'ụdị nke gị gbasata maka ya bụ ife nwanne anyị nwaanyị kwuru n'iru akwụkwọ gbasata maka ya bụ constitution a na-ekwu okwu ineba anya drop ọra ife iche on comment section below na Eastern News 24 bụ ebe anyị si na-ewetara unu ya bụ nnukwu ozi ya dị oke mkpa. Emeka si na eji ihe nwa ọkụkọ wenye aka enu akara owe ilo na ya ewetukwu ya ife niile na-abụ ife niile na Maazị Nnamdi Kanu na-ekwu dịka obodo onye ọkpọrọ asị mana ya bife kịta anụ abụ ihe niile ahụ kwuru ọdosi ezi ya bife bụ ihe a na-etinye ezi alụ ka maka esi wee mịa ọ dịkwanụ mma ụmụnne m maka ya bụ ụna anyị na-ana ọ dịgo obere oge na anyị ana na Chukwu kwere anyị na nkwa obere oge ka ọ bụzi owezi ihe ọzọ dị na ya ngwadaro dị na nke emesịa na ụmụnne m stay tuned at Eastern News 20